Good.
Oh, such good.
Good morning.
Oh, well done. I didn't know you had such range.
Well, Range by David Epstein taught me that.
Yes, I read a book to learn how to do this.
Yes, I read a book and it told me this is how it's done. That was a joke. Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, aliens, anyone who happens to be tuning in to this particular terrestrial broadcast. I don't know why I called it that, but now that I say that, I guess people in space could tune in. We should probably try and get the space station to watch it, or maybe one of those commercial space flights. Maybe we should get one of them to watch it.
I'm more interested in aliens watching.
Yeah, slightly less controllable, maybe. Slightly less controllable.
But Reed, if we're not really shooting for the stars here, then
so if you made the goal, let's shoot it so aliens can watch. I'd be like, well, we live in Texas, so due to different definition of the term, we find plenty.
Yeah, that was because I grew up in Roswell. This was always the joke.
You
right?
probably had both aliens.
Have you seen any aliens? And I'm like, wait. You need to be a little more specific about what kind of alien you're talking about.
And then they're just like, I have not, but I've been to that, McDonald's that looks like a UFO or whatever.
Isn't it amazing? Oh, yeah, that is the best McDonald's. I think it's like one of the only McDonald's that gets to break with brand because they, get to have a UFO park.
Yeah. The town where you have the coolest McDonald's, maybe arguably anywhere, and then you have the most disappointing alien museum in the world. It's like that's what your whole town's known for. Why not get together, bring in experts? I don't know. Maybe hire artists who were born there and then left and then went and did all these other random stuff. What happened to be this cool collection of skills that actually might make a really good alien museum.
Wait, do we know anybody like that?
I don't know.
Yeah, you know what's back when I was running the art gallery at Texas Tech, then Tech has a museum, and their museum director at the time actually at one point said, "Oh yeah, you mean the Xerox copy museum?" That's what the UFO museum there is. They just they got a hold of a Xerox copier and they just framed a whole bunch of Xeroxes, and then we're like, "See, aliens."
And ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who are not aware, Xerox is a copy machine manufacturer.
Yeah, it was right after the Gutenberg printing press.
Yes, very popular in the 80s and 90s, and then I don't know if they're still around. But
I don't know. Our company. This is talking about anachronistic crap. We've got a guy that prints out his emails, redlines them, and hands them to the secretary, and the secretary is then supposed to scan them in and then re-email back the scanned in image to people because he just doesn't want to deal with email.
Well, to be honest, props to that guy that he's able to
I
do
know,
that.
right? He must be
Like,
amazing.
I'm not gonna do it this way.
I will never use technology.
Yes.
Yeah, it sucks your soul in.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, what's the thought process going through his head there?
I don't know, but I mean, I can't help but think when it comes to copy machines and scanners that someone's got to have a butt that they put on there and they scan it, and then do they redline that too?
There's the crack.
So yesterday, yesterday was Monday.
Oh yeah, it was. And Mondays for me are usually a doozy. How about you, Reed? How was
Yeah,
yours?
it wasn't the stereotypical Monday that was, fraught with
Floppy?
doom and stress and long hours and things like that. But it was fraught with the sadness of an earlier sunset.
Oh.
Yeah, I was like, the sun was in my eyes on the couch. And so I did this really cool thing, which I've not been able to do for weeks. I closed the curtains a little bit.
You have a curtain?
I know. For those of you who are like, what is he talking about? Well, the writer here actually installed my curtain on Friday. So if you haven't seen that,
I just installed the curtain rod. Like I didn't do everything.
He didn't thread the curtain onto the rod, which is the hardest part. But yeah, that was our first kind of take at a longer DIY instructional. And, we didn't know how exactly it was going to go. But when we started doing it, all of these little tips and tricks kind of came up as we were going, kind of, I think, largely based on experience from things we have run into ourselves, problems we've seen other people run into, and various things like that. And so, it ended up being, I don't know, somewhere in the half-hour-ish range of us talking about how to install the curtain rod. But it went into, how do you find the stud? What does the framework look around a window or a sliding door? And, if you have underneath a window, where are the studs on there? And we talked about what happens if you drill a hole that's too big.
When we keep saying studs, like even trying to explain what that means, right? So that was one of the things I think Reed was really great at, because I just wanted to jump up there and start putting it up. And then Reed was like, okay, so what exactly are you doing and why are you doing it that way? And those are great questions to ask. It's one of those things that we were talking about in most DIY videos you see. I remember for artists anyway, there was always this idea that, like, here's how to draw an owl. Make 2 circles for the eyes, make a circle for the body, and then finish.
and then finish. I like that.
And it's supposed to look amazing at the end. And it's always like they just start out with, like, here's your drill gun and here's your curtain rod. And you just do that. It's done. Hooray!
Ding, 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 ding. That's funny. No, but one of the things that I wanted to point out was that this is pretty much the way that went is exactly how I see kind of our interaction with experts. Is you have somebody who's done this thing many, many times, and they have all of this other expertise around the topic and around the subject. But in the case of a lot of experts, and this is sort of true for Ryder, maybe not quite as much so, but the further into that expertise you get, the harder it can become to teach somebody who knows absolutely nothing, because at the very beginning you know absolutely nothing, and at the end you've forgotten all of the things that you already know.
Right.
Do you know what I mean by that?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's one of the hardest parts when I was having to learn how to teach art, right? Because I had been drawing since I was a kid. So all of a sudden somebody says, teach me drawing, teach me how to draw. Well, what am I going to do about that? Because this is instinctual for me at this point. So the idea that I could then somehow verbalize that, but not only verbalize it, you have to be able to somehow do it while showing what you're doing, each decision you make. It can't just be brain to hand. It's also like hand to, brain to mouth to hand all at the same time. And sort of saying, like, okay, right now I'm softening this edge so that I can then come back in and crisp this part up so that will make it look more volumetric, right? Being able to talk through that is much different than just sort of realizing it needs to happen and doing it. So, yeah, I learned a lot about that when I was teaching drawing and teaching art. When it comes to things like DIY, I'm not even sure sometimes what my brain processes are. I'm not sure what's going on in there. I just think, yeah, this is how this should work. And it just seems like intuition that just draws up from who knows where.
Well, and also, especially since you, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't go through any formal schooling or training with DIY. No. It was very much, I've got a project, I've got a deadline, it's tomorrow, I'm going to figure this out. You do the thing, probably mess up a little bit, and then you tweak and you adjust, or there wasn't something you didn't think about. But it's very much like, one term is just-in-time learning. So that borrows a phrase from what's the word? Supply chain, actually. So there's
Yeah,
something
yeah.
called just-in-time, which is basically instead of, let's say we're making the iPhones, right? Instead of having the manufacturer make 10,000 iPhone screens and then ship them all to Apple all at once, uh, they ship them just what they need for that week or that day or that month. I don't know exactly what length of time it is, but that enables them to start earlier, to go faster, to also have a knob that they can tweak. Hey, demand's slowing down, so we're going to not make as many. So glass manufacturer, make a little less screens this time. And that is great, and it has all these things on saving money, making things more efficient, all that kind of
Of
stuff.
course, it also during the pandemic we saw
Exactly.
the downsides of this just-in-time kind of mentality.
Right, exactly. I'm glad you brought that up. So since you kind of did this just-in-time learning with your
Yeah,
DIY stuff, like you may not even know, or you don't think in this. If I was going to teach somebody the fundamentals from scratch, here's what I would do, and here's the key
right.
things. Whereas me, as somebody who is kind of earlier on, I'm willing to put in a bunch of the research and the effort. And when I got the RV, that's largely when my DIY stuff got amped up to 11 because I had never even changed a car's oil before.
Yeah.
And for those who aren't aware, an RV is a combination of a car and a house. And I always said I don't want a house because I don't want to do all the work on it.
Right,
And I
right.
said I don't want to buy a car that's that old because I don't want to do all the work on it. So I bought a 20-year-old house that experiences an earthquake every day.
Yes,
And
yes.
and so you got to find out other things about cars, like, hey, when something is 20 years old, like the rubber, the brittle, or
Yeah,
it becomes
the
brittle, and
gaskets get really
so
brittle. Yep.
yeah, you start running into these other issues, or things like rust, and that's when
Ah,
it's like
yeah.
when you're doing the steps and you're following step 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's like, well, there's 4 steps, but guess what? After step 1, you have to deal with rust, you got to deal with these gaskets that are falling
Yeah.
apart. Yeah, so
I love how it's actually like a 400 step process that they've broken into four.
Right. Exactly. But that's how it goes, and it goes that way with entrepreneurship as well. You were just asking me before we turned the mics on, like how my day went the other day, and I was like, well, did we get a lot done? I was like, yes, we got a lot done, but we didn't
Yeah.
get a lot done because as we start doing the tasks, they start blowing up into all the subtasks.
Oh yeah, yeah, no, and I think that's just the nature of things. It's also the nature that's really fascinating about things like creativity and other things like that is everyone's afraid they're going to run out of ideas, but the what's really funny about that is the longer you spend coming up with ideas, the more ideas that keep coming up, the more questions you start generating, right? And so the deeper these things go, it's like everything can be sort of infinitesimally broken down into more and more nuanced things, and you can get to these sort of absurd levels of perfection. So the other key here is knowing when enough is enough, like knowing when you have pushed far enough. And so it's something that I ran into when I was doing. I think I might have just mentioned to you the other day that this weekend I installed a mini split air conditioner. This is my first time to ever install an air conditioner, much less a mini split. Typically, you need specialized tools for this. So in this case, it was.
Does anyone ever call you a specialized tool?
Yeah,
Because
I'm a generalist tool. Yeah, I'm a tool for all purposes.
Good,
Yeah, you can take
good.
me anywhere.
You're installing your air conditioner. Sorry.
Yes, I know. But yeah, so I had to get these. Well, I think that Reed and I've talked about. I don't know if I've mentioned it on air before, but some of the quotes I was getting for installing one of these mini splits, like the cheapest one was like $3,800.
And a mini split's a special type of
It's a special type
conditioner.
of it's a air conditioner heat pump. The technology is from Japan. They're popularized over there. They ship them over here. They're great for things like shops or single room cooling, small houses, and they don't require any of the duct work. So you don't have to have central heat and air, which has all the ducts running through the house. So that's one of the.
So you don't have to get all your
benefits.
ducks in a row.
No, no. Man, you're on fire today. Zing, zing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, but anyway, I installed one, and you just have to have special tools. But one of the things is copper flaring. You have to actually spread the copper out and then clean up the inside so that you can get a perfect fit onto the nut, so that you can hold vacuum basically, or go up to a couple hundred psi. So one of the things that I was learning was how to do that. And it seems like it's very easy to screw up. And then how much time do you spend learning this and doing this?
Right.
Or do you hire somebody to do it? Or what are the tools cost? Are you like, so you start running through all this math, and the equations on DIY is really kind of, I don't know, it's strange, it's awkward. I might buy a whole set of tools to only use them once. This might be the only time I ever do this. But in this instance, it saved me about $3,000 by buying these tools and
Oh, that's
installing
awesome.
this myself.
Yeah. Well, I like that idea of knowing when enough is enough, right? And we talked a little bit about it when we talked on Thursday, I believe, about the product purchase experience for us and how you and I was that Thursday?
Thursday or Friday?
Oh, Friday before we did the curtains.
Yes.
Okay, so Thursday or Friday, maybe Friday. But we talked
No,
about our.
You're right. It was Thursday.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, you're good. So
We're live on air.
Yeah, exactly. That's how you figure it out. So last Thursday, we talked about our purchasing decision process and the things that we think about as we're researching, and we used it under the guise of some noise canceling or noise isolation headphones because we had a listener write in, which was one of our new segments, which we called GAR. Go Ask Writer and Read. It's an acronym for those who are wondering why do they keep saying GAR?
Yeah,
GARR.
And also, we figured it tied in very well with the what the hell is water, because a gar is also a fish.
Yes, and that's what they call a happy coincidence.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. So, but yeah, I'd like to maybe talk about that a little bit more about how you know when you've gone down the rabbit hole just the right amount. So maybe we'll talk about that a little later. But the original thing I was referencing was how on Friday we had this thing where you were helping hang the curtain, and we were going through all of the simple steps, which are, you know, if I were to lay out the steps, it's screw the mounts onto the wall, put the rod or thread the curtain onto the rod.
Yeah.
And then put it on, and and then tighten the placement screw. Those are the 3 steps you could simplify it to, but there's so much more that goes into it. You got to find the stud. What happens if you make a hole that's too big? What are the tools that are best for the job? How do you best level it? Do you start in the middle? Do you start on the outside? Did you know that the ceilings and the floor of where you live probably aren't level? So that's a good thing to know. So these are just a handful of the things that came out as we were engaging with an expert such as yourself, and we have somebody who knows a little bit about the subject, but I don't know enough to where I actually now know all of the questions that would come up from a beginner. So that's my goal here, both me personally and with Helpful for Life as a whole, is we want to be that in-between between the experts and you guys. And of course, we want to hear from you guys as well. What questions do you have? What thoughts and concerns and stuff pops up in your head? Because guess what? If you're thinking it, somebody else is. Yes.
Yeah, and not only that, but oftentimes until we verbalize something, we're not even sure why we're doing it. Like I was talking about earlier, sometimes I'm feeling things and I'm reacting to these like intuitions. It's almost like I don't even really have concrete knowledge until somebody asks me a question. I'm like, oh, well, here's how I know this. Like Reed asked me how I know when I'm drilling into a metal stud versus a wooden stud. And I was like, I have never thought about that, yet my body somehow knows the answer. So then I had to verbalize it, and now it exists out there as a verbal thing, and I can actually think about it differently. So it's a learning process for me as well when I get asked these questions.
Yes, which brings up one other topic, which we'll do just a little short stint on today, which is how writing changes the way that you think, and what that's looked like for me and maybe for you over the last year or so. But that being said, I feel like that's a good enough of an intro. So let's just, as one last reminder before we rolled the intro for today, is the challenge from yesterday.
Yeah, challenge from yesterday was to watch David Foster Wallace's commencement speech or college speech, where he talks to the students, and the title of it is "This is Water."
Yeah, and for those who aren't aware or are either just joining us or whatever, yesterday was actually the first day that we came out with our new name, and our new name is "What the Hell is Water?" And so that yesterday we talked a little about what that name means and what the purpose of this podcast is, and a little bit about who Ryder is and who I am, to help you guys better know about what the point of this show is. And also, in case you are just joining us or you haven't been a long-time listener, we did something similar back in episode 0. So it might be interesting to go back and listen to episode 0 to see what we said then versus episode 30 after a month of doing it, what we said then.
Yeah, maybe we should do like just put it on the calendar and do a monthly recap where we try to explain what the show is
Yeah,
every
to
month
see how it
and
morphs.
watch it just
Yeah, that'd be kind of fun.
zigzag. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, with that being said, let's roll the intro. Helpful for life. Welcome to What the Hell is Water. I'm Reed Garcia.
This is Ryder Richards.
And I just somehow managed to pour coffee on my nose.
Oh, that's
a
impressive.
skill. That's a skill I have. I didn't know. Would you like me to describe how I was able to do it?
Can you describe that? Like, until it's verbalized,
You just
it's not
throw
real.
it. You just throw it right on your
It
face.
just shoots out.
Yes, exactly.
So you just stopped early with the coffee cup, and it just
Yeah. Sometimes you got to give yourself a little quick caffeine jolt, you know?
like right up the nostril. Like, yeah, I like this idea.
Yeah.
Maybe we should get straws.
What are those straws for? Oh, snorting coffee.
Snorting coffee in the morning. It
Oh,
gets it
iced
right
coffee, I
into the-
hope. Nope, just
Hot
fresh out the
coffee.
pot,
Yeah.
nice and hot. All right, well, let's talk for a second about how you know that to dive deep enough when you're doing that initial research, and let's do it in the guise of something you're working on, right?
Yeah.
So this is a natural thing that comes up anytime, but especially the looser something is defined, the harder this answer becomes. You know, I did some work over this weekend with one of my friends, and, you know, we were like, oh, all right, our goal is to do X. We want to get 10 of these things out into the world, right? We want to do this. And then as we were going, you know, it got closer and closer to the end. He's like, dude, this isn't going to work. We're not going to do this thing. And I'm like, don't worry, that's okay. Like, I knew from the beginning this probably isn't going to happen because of this exact thing we were talking about. I know as we start doing it, we have these 5 steps. They're going to turn into 50. But they were like kind of like freaking out and like upset and like, oh, I'm failing. I'm like, oh, sorry, I didn't set the expectations right, which is a great tie-in to Friday's conversation when we talked about expectations. It was the great weekend to have that conversation. I was like,
We're gonna fail.
yeah. So I went in. That's how you say go in past tense.
I like the idea. How does Reed enter a room? Well, he goos in. Nice sound effects. It's like Jello shaking.
Yeah. Sometimes I just go in. But yeah, I went into the weekend having that expectation and recognizing like we're probably not going to get to that thing because some of what we're doing, I recognize we're trying to make these 10 things right now, but I know we're going to be making 100 of these in the future.
Yeah, right.
And so part of the process is creating a process to where as you're going through these things, you're doing it and not necessarily right, but in a way that is going to help you be efficient, help you get the things that you want out of it. And then there's also this aspect of as you're doing the work, you're setting yourself up for future success. And also, as you're doing the work, is there a little something extra you can do while you're doing it that would be really easy while you're doing it, but would be hard to do later on when you're coming back to it?
Right.
Yeah, and just to stop talking in abstract terms, this is actually I'm talking about some of the marketing efforts that are required for this show. So every day we do an hour live show, but we recognize that not everybody wants to get up at 7:30, and oh, by the way, 7:30 is different for you if you're on the East Coast. You know, it's 9:30. If you're on the West Coast, it's 5:30. And not everyone wants to listen to us live, anyways. And not everyone may want to listen to the entire hour. And also, if you want to share something, maybe you want to share a smaller piece of it. And so we're working on things like naming all of the episodes, adding the descriptions that have all of the various segments in it, so people can more easily find them and reference them. And it's perfect for just about 10 minutes ago when I was like, hey, which episode was it when X?
Oh yeah, and it's like Thursday, Friday.
Right. We could just go, oh yeah, that one.
Yeah.
So that's part of the effort, but that requires this work, and there's these platforms that can help you do it better.
Yeah. And each platform is slightly different, and they all have different conventions, and it does make it tricky.
Yeah. So I guess now that I've kind of defined what my problem was, all right, I want to get 10 of these categorized and labeled and published. And how do I make sure I'm not setting up too much and spending too much time on the process versus doing the thing itself? Do you have anything that pops into your head as an example where you had some similar type of thing, or is most of your stuff one off?
Yeah, like I could go multiple directions with that. Like, of course, since I have my own podcast, then I can talk pretty easily about some of the difficulties that I ran into that were very similar. Like, just getting started, like the massive sort of effort it takes sometimes just to get things out into the world. Like publishing a podcast, that's easy, but getting it out for the rest of the world to see is difficult. So I could talk about the platforms I researched, what I used, and then the problem is once you're committed to a platform and you have that process in place, you're very hesitant to jump to a different platform, which might make life even easier.
Right.
So there's all these little problems, and also, is your platform constantly upgrading with all the new changes that are going on? So you have to always be asking yourself those questions. But it might be more fun if I talked about something like art, because when I'm doing something like making a painting, this painting is a one-off. And what I end up bringing to it are a whole set of various skills. How perfectly smooth do I need to get? Like, so say I make a panel, a wooden panel. I don't use canvas very often. I don't like canvas. And actually, if you look back at the history of painting, then canvas is a cheap alternative to using wood.
Huh.
And it was, you started in Titian, and it was a port city, and so what they would do is cut up sails off of ships and wrap them to make canvases. So originally they were just used for practice, and then they became an actual painting substrate that was used. And they're lighter, and there's some benefits to them, but they're also a lot cheaper. And so anyway, I like using panels, but how smooth does my surface need to be before I start painting on it? You can go down to all sorts of grits of sandpaper, but what is good enough? Like, how perfect does your surface need to be? Like, does it need to be so smooth that everything just glides across it? And then what happens then is you lose sort of a porousness and a texture. So how much texture do you want? And like, how far does this go? At some point, you can actually, it makes the painting more interesting to have sort of maybe a modulated surface rather than a perfectly smooth flat surface to paint on. So I'm always kind of interested in these things, like how far is enough, and at which point do you just embrace what you're left with there and you run with it and you use it as part of your system. And interestingly enough, a lot of artists, this becomes their style. Their quote style is actually just an accident of being super sloppy in the beginning, or they never knew how to properly do something, and then they just embraced that failure, and they just kept embracing it until it became a style.
And that's how a lot of people parent their kids too.
Woo! yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
I don't know. I never had kids, so yeah.
You've seen them.
You've
seen them. Actually, just yesterday.
I was walking into Reed's apartment building, and there's these, I guess, a mom and a grandparent or something. They're walking these two kids out, and the minute they walked out of the house, all you could hear is the kids are just screaming and yelling, and both parents don't say a darn word, and the kids are just wailing the entire way out to the car, and they're getting in the car and they're still wailing. And I was just like, what in the world is like, I was thinking to myself, like, what would have happened if I did that as a child? And of course, the answer is I would have been beaten soundly.
The staple gun was coming.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Shut those lips.
So we were talking about kind of a little bit about, I guess, the project process as the kind of the way I would describe it. And when you're going into a project, how do you decide how much work do I do up front? How much research do I do? How much do I focus on creating the right process for what I'm doing versus just jumping in and doing it? I was using the example that was relevant to me over the last few days, which was creating this show and cutting it up into smaller pieces and labeling it to make it easier to be marketed and shared, so that way we can grow and we can get more people seeing the show, helping more people, so on and so forth. And then Ryder was talking a little bit about how that might apply for him in art as he's working on a new piece of art. And some people might notice, like, he hasn't even started about the actual art making process yet. He's just talking about the board that he draws on. Yeah. And so you can see how easily you can get down into the weeds and you can spend a whole bunch of time. And I think for me, one of the most important things that drives this is two things: how well defined the thing is, how tightly structured you might say it is, and the timeline. And if you twist those two knobs one way or the other, it can drastically affect the thing. So in the example for me, if I said, hey, hard deadline, tomorrow I need to publish all 31 of these episodes, that's going to lead to a very different type of work than if I say, I'm hoping to get to it some of them tomorrow, and maybe the rest as the rest of the week goes on, and maybe it slips into next week. Those are two very different definitions, will lead to two potentially very different end results. And sometimes maybe it isn't a different end result, but we just think it is, because there's also this paradox, which I'm going to forget the name of, which is if you give yourself a certain amount of time to do something,
Right.
you will fill that entire time to do it.
Yes.
A classic example I can think of for this is packing for a trip. If you give yourself the night before you start at 3 p.m. and you're like, oh, I've got the rest of the day, you might end up packing for 4 hours. You just kind of come in, do this, do that.
I don't think I've ever had this
I know
problem.
you don't have this problem, but I know a lot of people who do.
Okay.
Versus if it's in the morning, you got 30 minutes till your ride's there. Guess what? You're going to freaking figure out how to pack in
You
30
will
minutes.
figure it out. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and you'll probably miss something, but I don't know. I'm just so much more of this mind frame that it's like, at some point I realized everywhere I go, they have these amazing things called stores where you can buy things. And so if I forget my swimsuit, guess what? There's probably a store where I can get a swimsuit. So I just kind of gave up on caring too much about packing. On occasion, it bites me in the butt. I'll forget a pair of shoes or pants.
Just
I
walking
actually
around
did
pantless.
forget pants one time, and that made it awkward because I showed up wearing shorts and with a button-down shirt. But
Stylish.
I don't know.
Made a
If you're-
good conversation.
Yeah, right. Hey, your legs are hairy.
That was the
you never
opener,
knew
huh?
this before. Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, so on the project process, do you how do you vibe it with the I see those two things as important. Structure, so I mentioned kind of time, but I also mentioned structure and expectation. So if someone, for example, with using your art example, it says, hey, I want you to give me this very specific type of painting. I'm looking for a lot of detail and a lot of texture and that. Oh, and you've got a week to do it versus a year versus no time frame. Like, what are your thoughts on one? Do you agree with this whole structure knob and this time frame knob? And then do you think there are any other knobs that exist when we're talking around this?
I'm sure there are, like, especially when I used to think about what made a successful art piece, I would talk about it in not necessarily in knobs, but in scales. So you could have, say, like 10 different metrics you could judge an artwork on, and each one of them would have a scale that they could. So if you want to talk about detail being one of them, the proportion, color, you could talk about various things, content, philosophy behind the piece, for instance. Those all those are knobs that you could adjust. But what's interesting is if you have a timeline, which is I need this done in a week, I find that there's almost like an internal clock that starts ticking, which is if I don't have the surface prepared within 2 days to make will allow me 4 days to actually spend on the piece, and then I need it like basically the last day to either dry or wrap the piece up. Then so you start sort of just breaking it down into little segments, like how much time will it take to package this? And in terms of the show, it might be how much time will it take to actually click all the buttons to publish the content, but you have to have the content first. So there's I usually use the prep phase, which would be to create the art board or whatever it is, the painting panel, and I use that time to actually sort of start processing out what the content will be, how long each phase will take me, which order to do them in. There's different schools of thought also on painting of which colors you lay down first, for instance. And so this might be how we're tagging or categorizing a podcast. There can be all these kind of little things you can think about in those frameworks, which steps and how much time each step will take. And if you don't get one done by the end of a certain day, if you're doing something on like a painting on a hard deadline, you just have to stay up later. There is no other alternative.
Yeah, and that's worth noting that sometimes that's just what you got to do, right? I mean, you don't have the option, and because you have that deadline, you have to meet it, right?
Yeah, there's been several nights where I just stay up or work for 16 hours a day on some sort of project over a weekend to get it complete. And a lot of times I have the piece like 90% done, and I just realize that the last 10% is going to have to be done in the gallery because I ran out of time.
Yeah.
And that's always pressure inducing. And whenever you travel with your art and you get somewhere, you never have the tools you need. You never have the space you need. You never have all the stuff you need. And so that incurs more trips to some place like art stores or Home Depot. There's also things like framing. A lot of people want art framed, and you have to build in time for framing. And if you can't frame yourself, that means you're reliant on somebody else's timeline at that point. So if they ask for it in a week, and it's going to take 5 days to get it framed and get it back. Guess how much time you have?
Right.
And so there's all these little pieces that fall into place there. And I think after doing enough projects for enough time, there becomes an intuitive sense of it. If you're a newbie to it, though, how would you know any of this?
Right.
Like, the only way I think you learn it is by failing and being really, really frustrated the first couple times.
Yeah, and this project process is something that, big surprise for some people, interests me a lot. It is the idea of having a process that you're working on, and of course being able to think about how could I do it better, how does this affect the short term versus the long term, which is a quick little tie-in to something we're going to talk about a little later today, which is the difference between tactics and strategy.
Strategery.
Yeah, strategery. Ooh,
Oh,
nice.
Shred
I'm just gonna goo my way out of this situation. But this project process is something that interests me, and so.
By the way, I have to go back to the goo.
Yeah.
Have you noticed on every television show, wherever they're doing some sort of surgery, or there's always like on a sci-fi show, there's an implant, and they have to like cut the skin.
Okay.
And to get the implant out, and it always goes.
Yes.
Like, whose skin makes that sound?
That is a great point, which is going to lead to one of our challenges today. This is kind of a mini challenge, but today, when you're watching a professionally produced TV show or movie, it can't be one of these low budget people doing it on their own, because they probably don't do sound effects. But an actual TV show or a movie, pay really close attention to the sound effects, and you will recognize there's some that don't really line up, or it's like, that doesn't sound that way.
No.
One of the classic examples I think of is the creaking door. Like, everyone goes through a door and it's got this
Yeah. Yeah. The other fun one is a gun. If you've ever, because I grew up with guns, like every time someone touches a gun, it goes click, 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 and I'm like a transformer, like it's pieces of metal shaking around, and I'm like, no well-built gun sounds that way. There is no sound when you pick up a gun.
Or a sword that's
Yes.
coming out of the sheath. Like, it's like, that was a leather sheath.
That was a metal on metal sound, but
Yeah.
that's leather.
Yeah. So it's kind of fun. So that's a mini challenge for you guys today. Go watch something, especially if it involves a lot of things going on in the world. It could be, soap operas could be fun too, but even actions and things like that. And also listen for the Wilhelm scream. Do you know what that one is?
Yes.
Let me hear your best impression.
No, you go for it. But it's the yeah. It's in like it seems like every horror movie has to include it. It's like a trope now, right?
Yeah, but it's funny because it also, people will then take that scream and they'll manipulate it a little bit and they'll put it in different ways, and it's like, wait, was that the? And it's like, I feel like Star Wars used it in some ways. Like, did they morph the Wilhelm scream to become the drive sound for one of their planes?
As it takes up.
Yeah. But yeah, so we're talking a little bit about the project process, and Ryder and I were talking a little bit about how do you know how much work you should do up front, how much should you focus on the process itself versus just doing the thing. And we talked a little bit about how that might be different if you're an expert you've done the thing many times. You have a lot of experience to base the thing off of.
Right.
I remember when I was working back at Boeing, that was a big thing about people who were making proposals for new contracts, and they're saying, hey, we're going to build this satellite, and they're referencing other satellites that we've done, but most of the time there's some new thing that's involved. So they have to look at, okay, in the past we bid whatever. We said we're going to be able to build this thing. I'll just use easy numbers, right? $100 million to build this thing. And then there was this $20 million special electronics we put on it. Well, this new customer wants that new $20 million, but when we were making it last time, it actually cost us internally $40 million. And so now we're going to have to change what we do for these future people, because that's one of the things about the project process is if it involves a customer, you and you, the person who is making something, then you have a different set of expectations and a different thing, and maybe that knob of price and time, they're not quite as easy to turn, right?
That's such a good point.
Right.
Yeah. Wasn't really thinking about that, but yeah, who you're making it for determines so much. When you're making it for yourself, you can feel free to make all these weird little decisions, or you can get super fussy about it. You can go way overboard on your own time, and you can also go way underboard on your own time. You can make what, I really like this insane color of yellow, and you can put it on something, and that if you're building that for a client, they're not gonna like it, but that's not a choice
Right.
that, you
And
know.
and likewise, the client does not recognize. They see the 3 steps. They don't see the 35 steps that come out from that. They're not going to be like, "Writer, I can tell here by the texture you only went to 2,000 grit. I like mine on 4,000
Yeah,
grit."
right.
And that being said, I'm sure there are some customers who
Oh,
are exactly
geez,
like that.
you know, it's not shiny enough. It's also, since I am in the graphic design world, it's always, can you make the logo bigger? I don't know. I just need it to pop. What do you mean? It just needs to pop more. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is funny because everything in high-end design has zero pop. But, you know, it's not zero, but I find it to be kind of interesting what people actually want seems to be influenced by other things, such as bad car dealership ads. Like, that's actually what they want when you do design work for them. And so you're in this kind of weird translator between two different people. So when you're talking about dealing with customers, there's this translation that has to happen between what you would like to do and what you know as a professional would be best, and somehow making this other person happy.
Yeah, and it's funny because we started out talking about the project process and how do I decide how much to do, how much I'm going to put in up front versus just doing it. And it really quickly starts to involve other people, and it
Yeah.
really quickly starts to say, what would these people think, what would these people do? And guess what, so many things come into play there: psychology, sociology, all of these
Yeah.
fancy ology words. But basically, one of the things is you got to decide, okay, how much am I going to tell the person versus not, and how much am I going to be willing to cede, to give up the things that I really want to do, versus just standing up for what I want. And then if the case where not only are you creating something for an end customer, but you also work for a company yourself, and it's like, well, I'm representing this company, and there's also the office politics involved, and so it gets really messy really quickly. But it seems like that's one of the type of things that is perfect for us to talk about from all these different angles. And I want to bring on some experts in the project process as well, so we can kind of dive into this a little bit more. Go ahead.
Yeah, but you know, I'm thinking, sort of circling back around to this kind of marketing thing, the sort of journey or path that we're taking, and when do you know that you're doing enough? And part of it is you could always be doing more.
Right.
And so if you're not putting anything out, then nothing will ever come from it. There's this problem that is the paradox of getting locked up with your own perfections, right? Always thinking about the thing and not doing the thing. At some point, having out a mediocre product might actually be better than having out nothing at all. So when do you draw that line? When do you know that you're going to get this out within the next week so that you can actually spend the rest of your time working on future projects? Sometimes you just need to, like, go ahead and say, I'm going to forgive myself for these first 30 episodes being published in a way that is not perfect, so that I can actually move on to making the 31st and 32nd episode amazing.
Exactly.
And so there's a lot of problems with dealing with a backlog of issues that actually stops you from being even better in the future. So it's sort of like, where are you spending your time and energy? And these are all little, I don't know what, like, it's almost strange heuristic equations that we're making all the time.
Exactly, and that's what makes entrepreneurship so difficult, is because you are balancing that equation all the time. And it's not just, am I doing the thing? It's like, nope, there are all these things you need to be doing. Now you got to decide, all right, how much time is it worth spending on each of these things? And for each of these things, there's no way I could do the perfect process for every one of those things. But I recognize that for a lot of these things, these are things my company is going to be doing for many years to come. And guess what? Anything I set up now, even if I'm not intentionally creating a process, I am creating a process.
Yeah,
and that means that when somebody else comes along and starts doing it, then they're going to have to go off of what I tell them, right? And they're going to go off of my process, which may not be very well defined at that point. And so there's pros and cons. And it's like, okay, well, maybe I spend a little bit more time up front knowing that other people are going to be doing this, and knowing that I will be much better able to easily explain something while I'm in the weeds figuring it out. And it's like, oh yeah, there's this weird tweak within this software that's not obvious, but you got to know to press this one thing, otherwise it doesn't go how it does. If I'm trying to do that in the moment while I'm learning it the first time, versus when I'm a year later coming back, guess what? A year later coming back, I have to do so much more to get that context, to remember what was going on, in order to say, like, oh yeah, there was that one tweak. But there's also something to be said about just doing it and not getting locked up by the perfectionist process. And that's what this show came from. I found one of the traps that I fell into was I was spending too much time on the perfectionist thing, and I'm focusing so much more on finished published content. And I was like, you know what? I just need to just cut the legs out from under that one and not give myself an option. Now every day by 8:30 a.m. Central Time, we have an hour of content. And so now we've got the engine started, and now it's just about laying the tracks in front of the train as it's moving.
Yeah, which is that was the way I started doing my podcast as well when I first started. And it's also, I think, the way that the art career runs. You can build up a body of work and then start going around shopping it out. But you also end up finding, and this is what was kind of, we're part of a book club, Reed and I are, that, and one of the things that's fascinating about people that show up with let's say a resume that hops all over the place, and it's these people who have made several career changes.
They zigzag.
That's what David Epstein was calling it, zigzagging or meandering. And so what ends up happening is, what he was talking about is how they're actually taking information they learned in a certain field and they're pivoting. So it looks like a zigzag, but it's actually a pivot to a different direction that they're interested in or that they find compelling. And so he said the difference in that person getting a job just by showing their resume and the next guy who has the same type of resume not getting that job is that the people who are really good at getting the job tie it together into a narrative. So they find a story to like stitch together their zigzags that shows how they have learned from each step along the way to change themselves. Because at the end of the day, that's what you want in a company. You want somebody who's going to adapt to situations. You don't want somebody who's just stuck in a mold moving forward blindly. So it can be a really beneficial thing, but when you start out on a show like this, there's going to be some zigzags. And when we're getting our content out there and doing our marketing, a lot of it is A/B testing constantly. And that's actually just a technical way to talk about, I can't figure out the best way to do this, so I'm going to find out 2 or 3 ways to do it. We're going to blast it out and just see what the results are.
Yes, and to tie a bow on the A/B testing, you have one way of doing it that you publish to a certain subset of people, and then you have, which we'll call A, and then you have another subset that you do it a different way to B. And then you see, 45% of people clicked on A, but only 20% clicked on B. So then you say, we're going to do A for everybody now. So that's what A/B testing is. But, I think a lot of people might be sitting here listening to this, and they might be wondering, like, you guys are talking much about projects and companies and things like that. Why would I care about that? I don't have a job. I'm not worried about any of these things. And the stuff that I do, if I do have a job, somebody else worries about that. But guess what? This applies to you on an individual level, right? I mean, if you haven't already, you should consider looking at your life and yourself like a project or like a company, and saying like, hey, if I, for example, am a company, well, what are things I should think about? Well, let me think about, where do I want this company to go? Where do I want myself to go? And then what are the things I need to do to get to that spot? And then how do I start doing those things, right? So it's the same kind of thing. Like, do I spend years and years coming up with my ideal life plan or whatever? Or is it, I'm just going to, I recognize I want to get here. I can see I can roughly go there. All right, so then I just do that. So, it's, even though we're talking in the terms of projects and companies and marketing and things like that, it still very much applies to the individual. But we're going to put a pin in the project process talk for now. We kind of just scratched the surface of that one, and there's a lot of different places we could go with that. And one of them is the value of recording information and writing things down as you're doing it, which ties into Rome research, which we've talked about before and we're not going to go into right now, but just another time where it's great. And that's one thing I really love about the software is now, as I'm doing things, as I'm learning things, I always have that notebook open. And even if it's just something as simple as researching what kind of Bluetooth keyboard I'm going to get, now I have that all written down. And next time I buy a keyboard, I can just go back and see, here are the things that I was concerned about, and here's why I ended up with the one I want. And now 10 years down the line, if somebody else in the team or whatever needs a keyboard, I'd be like, well, go look at that. You'll see all the concerns. Maybe there's a couple things that have changed since then, but that's pretty much it. And instead of having to start completely from scratch. So there is value in documenting your thoughts and in the context of where it goes on. And by the way, now I can see, what was going on that day, that week. Why was the larger part of that that process, and that's some of the value that Rome provides. But we're going to shift over to talking about tactics versus strategy. So, Ryder, when I say
Mm.
tactics versus strategy, first off, what do you think tactics are? What do you think strategy is?
Oh man, it feels like it's militaristic, which is Grr. Which is sort of funny because of course almost all bureaucracy stems from the military. Which is a sort of fascinating idea to think about. So when you're in a company and you're moving around and you're like, man, this rigid bureaucracy, well, it's because it actually stemmed from the military. But when we start thinking about things like tactics and strategy, I tend to think of tactics as short-term measurable goals, and I tend to think of strategy as an overarching kind of maybe almost like a mission to get where you want to go. I don't think those are the proper definitions. I haven't really thought about it in a while, but I do tend to think of tactics as short term and strategy as being long term. So, like maybe tactics win you the battle, but strategy wins you the war.
Yeah, no, and that's pretty much spot on. I'm going to look up the official definitions here just so we can see at least what a dictionary says.
Yeah.
But that's exactly how, I mean, pretty much how I would describe it, right? So there's, and the view I like to look at it through is games, especially board games or tabletop games, if you want to use a more generic term. Um, there's two aspects. You have some goal that you're trying to achieve, and over the long term you need to be keeping in mind certain things as you're going that help determine what your actions are in the short term to help you achieve that long-term success.
Yeah.
And so that is strategy. So focusing on the longer term, and focusing on what that overarching thing. So in the terms of a company, like that's one of the big things that's important for the CEO or the corporate executives, right? Like they need to be looking at the long term, considering the strategy. Then there is the shorter term, which would be called the tactics, and that is in a board game. What am I going to do this move? What am I going to
Yeah.
do maybe next move? Within the short future, near term future, what am I going to do? And ideally, if you've got good strategy and good tactics, your tactics will line up and support your strategy.
Yeah, you can see them operating in tandem. It seems like one of the problems, especially in marketing, people talk about even marketing and branding. You'll have people who specialize in tactics and people who specialize in strategy. And you'll even have people who specialize in marketing and people who specialize in branding. And so you might think all these terms are kind of synonymous, but there are differences between them and there's different approaches to it. Um, One of the fascinating things about tactical is it can be something like we want to get 100 new followers on Facebook this week, and then you can develop a strategy around how you're going to get that, and then you can also have tactics involved in how you're going to get that.
Right.
And all these things can be infinitely decreased down to individual projects, or they can be overarching projects. But the tactics would be there that this is a measurable, achievable goal. And then what are you going to do to get that goal? And what are you going to do to hit it? You can also, with tactics, tell if you failed.
Yeah.
With strategy, it's usually a longer term game and it's harder to figure out if you're actually achieving it.
Yes. And so, real quick, since I pulled them up using Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, the strategy definition lines up very, very closely with what we were saying. A careful plan or method for achieving a particular goal, usually over a long period of time. A second definition, now this is actually under the essential meaning, which I'm not exactly sure if that's slightly different than there's another one that says full definition. So,
Oh, okay.
and the second one is the skill of making or carrying out plans to achieve a goal. So that's strategy and tactics. The first one says the science and art of disposing and maneuvering forces in combat. So kind of like you were talking about. And then it says the art or skill of employing available means to accomplish an end. So it doesn't have like a very in the dictionary definition, which as some people may know is different than how things are actually used, and I guess that's why they had that full meaning. Is kind of that's one of those times.
Yeah.
But with the tactic, it didn't have a very specific thing that it said about short term, but I know that's how people often use those terms, right? Both in the game world and the war, which some people call war games world, and yeah, just in the larger discussion of English, right?
Yeah, yeah. There's something here too about actions that are performed. And this is one of the funny things. When I was installing this air conditioner this weekend, my dad was with me. He was helping me out. I was thinking about this tendency that we have to want to take actions. And there are certain people who are really great at taking action. So if you say we want 100 new followers on Facebook, there's people who are like, okay, give me the content, I will post it. And there's other people who are much more interested in generating the overarching idea of what the content should be. And so there's this kind of breakdown of taking action and then doing the thinking and then what comes of the production. And there's all these little things you can break it down into. And I tend to think that it's quite easy on occasion to jump straight into the tactics. But if you don't have sort of a strategy in place, like what I really enjoy is a good strategy can determine your tactics for you.
Yes, yes, and I'll even take that one level further back, which is your purpose, your mission, your vision, whether that's your company or like we were talking about earlier, your yourself, right? That if you have that, that is the why, and that actually drives your strategy, which drives your tactics.
Yeah.
And that's where some people and some companies struggle is they don't have these very well defined, or they don't have them defined at all. When I say these, I mean the mission, the vision, the purpose. They don't know their why, right? And so that makes it harder for them to make these decisions. But if you do a good job defining the why, it actually, anytime you come to that fork in the road where you're like, all right, should I go take this strategy or this strategy? You know, oh, this one lines up better with that thing I'm trying to accomplish. And so that actually leads to you choosing that strategy, which leads to you choosing the tactics you do on every individual turn. If we're talking about a game, or if we're talking about life every day, like what are those choices you're making? What are the things you're doing? Where are you spending your time? Where are you putting your energy?
And what's fascinating is it's easier to drift through life without a strategy. I mean, it's just easier cognitively. It's not actually easier on your life. It's harder on your overall life. But it's easier to not have a strategy and just make decisions in the moment. And if you're playing a board game, it's like, well, I'm going to attack here. I'm going to defend here. I'm going to move over here. I'm going to, you can just make random decisions. And at that point, they really are random. These are just impulses that are entering you. There's no larger kind of guiding principles behind them. So one of the things about having a strategy is you all of a sudden, it makes all those little decisions, the little tactics, it makes them a little bit easier because you have an overarching goal to align yourself with. So sometimes it can feel like setting up a strategy is going to be hard and difficult, but man, does it help with all the small tactical decisions.
Yes, and that's what we're all about here at Helpful for Life, and with What the Hell is Water, the show. We are here to tell you that, hey, it is worth time to take a little, it is worth your time and effort to create that vision, that mission, that purpose, even if it's just for yourself as an individual. Why? What is your why? And then that will help better inform your strategy and your tactics as you go through life. So I think that's what will make our challenge for today.
Okay.
And we're going to keep it very, very easy because we want to make sure that people can do it, don't have any issues with it. Just start thinking about it. Start thinking about what is your why. And it can be that simple of a question. Now, we're going to do more in the future where we have more defined things, and maybe we'll have some guides around it, and we'll have some people on to help you with this type of thing. But for right now, let's just keep it that simple. What is your why? Why do you do? And it gets real existential really quick.
Oh,
but
yeah,
what's
that's a
what
big
is
one. Yeah.
right? It's like, oh, what is the purpose of your life, or what are you trying to achieve, or whatever? And this can mean any sort of thing, and this is a very individual thing, right? And for some people, they want to or feel like they need to include some sort of religious aspect, which I think if religion is part of it, that's perfectly fine. But I would encourage you, like, okay, I do it all for my higher God, or however you would like to phrase that. But maybe push back that a little bit, push past that a little bit and say, oh, well, okay, well, what's the next thing? Okay, yes, I'm doing it all for that, but maybe are there something specific that I
Are
can
you
aim
also,
for?
is part of your why, having money so that you actually can help out with other things? Like maybe that lets you participate better with your religion. I don't know. Like there's all sorts of other steps that go into this. Why do you have the job that you have? How do you interact with your family? Like these are all big things that, what is your why can mean a lot. You can also break it down to little things like, what is your why for today?
Yes.
Like, and so you can sometimes chop that down and say, you know what? The only thing that's really important today is that my wife knows that I love her.
Yeah.
And you can actually make that your why for living today.
And that's what I would really encourage you guys to, especially with this first cut at it, right? Don't over define it. Don't spend,
Yeah.
hours and hours and days working on that. Just for this first cut, let's just write something down. So I'm giving you the structure, I'm giving you the timeline, and saying, look, by tomorrow, whenever you're listening to this, give yourself a day, come up with a why and say, this is my why. And recognize, guess what? That's going to shift, that's going to change, but that's your why for today or this week or whatnot. And so I wanted to share, I figured it would be a good time for me to share the why for Helpful for Life, right? So we have a vision, a mission, and a purpose. And our vision is to be the first resource people across the world consult when making life choices. Our mission is to empower you to do what you want to do. And our purpose is to be a well-researched resource accessible to people of all walks of life, educating and empowering them to confidently do what they want to do. So in case you didn't hear it in there, that's very you-centric, you, the audience member. That is our purpose. Our vision is to help you. So please make sure that you are contacting us, letting us know what is it that you want help with, what is it that you are struggling with, what is an area of your life where maybe I recognize it could be improved a little bit, but I don't know exactly how. Those are the exact type of questions that we at Helpful for Life are here for you. And especially on this show, we have a segment just for this type of thing.
Yes.
Garr! Go ask, writer, and read.
Yeah.
So leave a comment in the section below on whatever platform you're on, or go to our website, helpfulforlife.com, and click the Contact Us button in the top right. So that's our challenge for today. What is your why? And so just to wrap up today, we talked a little bit about the project process. How do you know how deep to go up front? How much do you focus on the process and the thinking versus the actual doing? And then we talked after that about the difference between strategy and tactics and how they are different. And strategy is a little bit more about the long term, and tactics is more about the short term. What am I going to do today? What am I going to do on this turn, whereas strategy is more about the longer term, and those tactics help that strategy happen. And then going one step further is the why, and that's how we ended up with our challenge for today. Is by having a well-defined why, it helps you have a better defined strategy, which will help you have a more easy tactics. And although it's counterintuitive, we at this show are all about, and this company are all about telling you, hey, it seems like it might be easier to do it the way you're doing it, but if you put in a little bit of work and you do a little of these things that we're helping you with, it's going to make your life better every day. Literally every day.
Yeah. Yeah, it actually makes, sometimes putting in a little work up front makes the rest of your day a whole lot easier. And it's same with your life.
Yeah, and it helps, every day. If you don't realize it, but how many thousands of decisions you're making
so
every single
many.
day. So we're reducing the cognitive load. We're reducing how hard it is for you to make those decisions by defining these things. So you make those decisions easier times thousands. That's a pretty good return.
Yeah, that's a great return. And if y'all are interested in some way of like workshopping what this is, let us know. I think this is something Reed has already put some time and effort into, and we'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, and that is it for today. So thank you guys so much for coming in today.
Yep.
And, being you, Why? Because I said so.
Why? All right.